Hello, everybody. Welcome to this open-ended conversation with Melodie Leung. So this is the second conversation we're having for Open-Ended, which is a platform for activists, designers, and thinkers around the world, where we're bringing basically leaders in design to come together to explore the spaces where creativity, culture, and design intersect with technology, science, and engineering. And we are really bringing this with a lens on challenging existing structures and entrenched perspectives. So Melodie is actually a really good friend of mine. I would say one of my best friends, and somebody that I turn to for support and inspiration and guidance all the time. So I'm really honored and excited to have her here. Equally, she is a leader in the space of design and culture, not only in Europe, but she's been working on projects all over the world. Her actual job description is she's a senior associate at Zaha Hadid Architects, and she's been there for about 15 years. And she and I met at the Serpentine Galleries in London in 2016 as part of an exhibition that she had helped to set up, which was a virtual reality collaboration that we did from Google Arts and Culture to bring some of Zaha Hadid's early artworks to life in VR. And the exhibition itself was of Zaha's early paintings. And really beautiful and moving. So her practice actually extends into architecture, interiors, product design, and also furniture design. And she also has been leading the gallery space for Zaha in London and Clerkenwell. And I would describe her as a teacher, a thinker, a curator. She's also really actively engaged in contemporary culture, from art to fashion to design. So I've seen her at lots of Central St. Martin's graduate shows, for example. And she also recently led a unit at the Architectural Association focusing on tall buildings. And finally, she is the force behind In Conversation, which is the seminal Women in Architecture conference that she runs with the Museum of Architecture in London. So she's going to be speaking to us today about technology, culture, identity, and some of her work. So really excited to have you here, Melodie, today.
Thank you for having me.
So Melodie, welcome to this conversation. I'm super excited to be talking to you about your work in design and also your dreams for the future for Open-Ended. She has had an incredible career at Zaha Hadid Architects. When did you start, Melodie?
Thanks to her for having me. Over 15 years ago, yeah, then I'll belie my age. I'm a senior associate. So, and it's been an incredible journey. I mean, I came to London to work for Zaha. And I think I always tell actually my students that every year that I'm in architecture as a practitioner, it expands my definition of what it encompasses. And I would say that that is very much due to me being so fortunate to be with such an exciting practice, which is really pushing, I think, the boundaries of what we can create and how we can approach shaping the built environment.
I love that. So for me, you are one of you epitomize what it means to be a designer in a way that is very activist. You're constantly looking to change and to grow. But I'd love to start sort of at the beginning of your journey, when you moved to London, how you decided to come and work with Zaha, and a little bit about the very beginnings and working with her and finding your place in this really unusual design firm for the time. And obviously, even today, it's a very unique architectural practice.
Yeah, where do I start? So I think it was a decision that I made when I studied in New York. So I did my master's degree at Columbia University, and I was introduced to Zaha through a professor that I worked very closely with. And when I came here to meet her, I kind of just thought it would be great to get out of New York, because when you study in a place, it becomes very much a certain kind of bubble, I think, as a student, as a practitioner, and I wanted to explore a bit more, and I was always drawn towards Europe. And when I came here to work for her, it was a very pivotal point in the practice history. When I joined, it was about 80 people, and within 3 years, we more than tripled to over 300. And so through that time of quite extraordinary change of scale, it was also coinciding with a kind of global recognition of the projects that we were getting built. So no longer was it just about the competitions that we were winning, but it was also about the ways that we could also find solutions within the construction industry to create these buildings that up until then had always mostly existed on paper. And it's been, I mean, it's this kind of, I think we'll go into this in a bit as well, but it's quite fascinating as a journey through time because there are certain moments that stand out and it's not necessarily a very linear process. But through it all, I think looking back, it was an extraordinary chance to be able to work so closely with Zaha. And there are many ways in which we come from very different backgrounds. And joining the office was an incredible exposure to a global international practice where we have over 50 different nationalities. And even the ways that we communicate with our colleagues are very, very different. The kind of education background that we have, the ways of communicating, the body language, all of this takes a certain amount of, I think, elasticity and stretching on everyone's behalf, but that's also what makes it a super energetic and exciting place to be.
So then taking like a giant step back, so you come to this like design firm and there's all these projects going on and you just kind of run with it and you're working with Zaha and she obviously thinks in this incredibly interdisciplinary way between, we all know about fashion, furniture, obviously the buildings. And it sounds like that energy and that ethos has continued after, her passing away. So for me, that's really interesting, is to think about how you start with this vision of one person, this energy, and obviously the people who come on board share a similar vision or energy or want to be part of a practice that crosses dimensions in a way that's hard to define in what we call traditional architecture, but are continuing to do so. So it sounds that as though, I mean, I think you said this to me earlier also, is that although that vision hasn't shifted, the tools are now shifting. So you're going into different kinds of technologies, and the way the firm is set up is obviously allowing for new projects that are very creative and innovative in their own ways, despite the fact that you guys are at the very edge of what it means to do cutting edge design. So I'd be really curious about that then, is how the team is set up now, how the organization is set up, and a little bit of how you, because you don't just sit in one team, I know you've kind of moved from project to project, how you decide how you move between these various initiatives, what that means in terms of your own day-to-day, and how you get your head together for doing something that, sort of spanning the actual design galleries in Clerkenwell to sculptures, large-scale sculptures in London and so on.
I mean, exactly like you said, I think one thing that we continue to learn as a team is the way that Zaha created this practice, which was in a sense greater than the sum of all of its parts. So while she started with this incredible vision that really galvanized people towards her, and then she created a space for these very talented people to also be able to thrive. And it was crucial that they were very that they were problem solvers, that they could take the initiative and the responsibility for themselves to be able to push these projects and to get them built. And then I think it always came to a point also where it became so large and it became so multifaceted that there was also this struggle that she had with, I think on the one hand, where she was trying to take the practice and where the practice ended up taking her. And I think that kind of energy at the same time, or that kind of struggle and the balance, is also it's precarious on the one hand, but it's also what keeps us really driven. So there's very, very ambitious, optimistic, problem-solving people on our team. So every year we have young graduates that are really well versed in the latest types of CAD software, who even grew up in a very different generation that we did in relation to computers. But there's also the tools in terms of what's becoming much more widespread and used in the construction industry, and how that can also feed into and inform our designs. So there's a lot more also sophisticated software where we can simulate environmental factors such as the amount, and which leads into the kind of carbon footprint of a building. So all of these factors can be much more robustly integrated from the very early stages of a design project. There's one timeline which says that it's, you know, we're in a tiny blip of deep time of the existence of the cities that have been evolving, the natural resources that we're using. But on the other hand, our relationship with technology seems to be evolving at a much higher rate. And so it also becomes that much more critical that we utilize these tools and we continue with that rate of evolution to be able to harness what they can do. And I think the vision has to evolve with that as well, in terms of our ambitions of being able to, what we can incorporate and what we can address through our designs, through our shaping of the built environment. And sometimes that's also then leading into maybe some realms that aren't as traditionally considered a part of architecture. For instance, like we have a virtual reality team, which on the one hand, I met you through, we were working on some immersive digital paintings, but on the other hand, they're also looking at how do we...
Shall I say what that was?
Sure.
So you were basically one of the leaders, and I think we'll come to this later as your work in the cultural space, but you basically helped to bring this beautiful exhibition to the Serpentine Galleries. I think it was in 2016, right? It's a long time ago now where we met. Mm-hmm. And you collaborated with Google Arts and Culture through your team, and we created a series of VR experiences around, I think it was 4 of Zaha's early paintings. Mm-hmm. And it was this incredible moment of seeing kind of you guys coming with, you know, this individual known for design and buildings, and then just these beautiful artworks, paintings, but equally trying to bring them to life in virtual reality felt very poignant for you and for your team, and of course for her family. The sense of what did she actually see when she saw the canvas, and what did she imagine when she painted? And do you think you could talk about that just a little bit? Because I think it was a really moving exhibition, but equally what we did with the VR collaboration was bringing, I think it was the best of what you can do with technology, although of course it was a few years ago, this idea of bringing feeling and heart to an experience, which is often quite hard to do.
No, exactly. And I think that that's where, I mean, it's always hard to, let's say, summarize what I learned from Zaha from working with her. But I think at the end of the day, if I had to sum it up, it's about this idea of creating something that's very well composed. And a composition it can be interpreted or defined in any number of ways. But that's why it was something that she was very inspired by in the Russian avant-garde, which was this kind of obsession with finding the right balance with whether they're shapes on canvas, whether they're spaces and the elements that hold those spaces together. She was trained up very much at a time when the general architectural field was looking at the modernist grid. And so she's very well known for talking about all of the other angles besides the 90-degree angles. Why do corners have to be 90 degrees? Why do we have to follow the structural grid when actually there are all these other different ways that we approach, other angles, other perspectives that we approach the spaces that we inhabit. And so in a kind of abstract analogy way, she was taking from this art movement, this kind of experimentation with composition, and trying to take that as a way to innovate within architecture. But across all of these different scales, it's still always about coming down to how people are connected, how we move, how we react both as very individual species of nature, but also as large communities and connective networks.
So that's obviously evolving right now in the space that we're in, is where we're sitting in isolation. And I know you just taught a class on tall buildings at the Architectural Association. And I'm really curious to think about, or to understand how you see that kind of practice and that kind of thinking tying into your own academic teaching and thinking, but equally your own work right now.
Mm. Yeah, so that was great. At the Architectural Association, we led a unit called Experimental 18, and we were working mostly with second and third year students. So in a way, it was a big learning jump for them to all of a sudden look at the city of London, where they've been studying, and see the city in through a very different lens. Something from teaching that I remember from many years ago that really I was reminded by was how it's really about teaching the students how to see things differently. We went on a tour of the cheese grater or Leaden Hall, and I walked them through the base, which is very open and connected at the ground level to the kind of neighboring square. And I asked them what they saw. And it was really funny because they didn't remember. And I think for me, that was an analogy for the entire year in the sense that I was always reminded not to take for granted what I was trying to teach them or to help them see. And sometimes things that I thought I had told them before or we had discussed, I realized they understood it in a slightly different way. And so the importance of that back and forth communication, because I also learned so much from them, but that was really critical. And then to take that into something where they're trying to understand something at the scale of a city, and then something as intimate as how do you navigate when you walk into a lobby? How do you find the lift? How do you create spaces that are very intuitive and communal to gather when you have such a limited footprint? How can you create these social spaces when you have such a vertically stacked, quite restrictive, let's say, format, which is very much governed by not just physical, structural, environmental forces, but also financial forces.
And so there's a little bit there about coming back to that idea of space, right? And how, as an architect, you're constantly thinking about the spatial experience, whether it's tall buildings, whether it's virtual reality. Is that constantly on your mind? And has that the definition of space evolved over your career because you're thinking so laterally about design as a practice?
I mean, absolutely. But at the same time, I think we also have to edit what we're doing at that moment. So that's where this kind of zooming in on project and sometimes being really concerned about one bolted connection between two pieces of metal, and then zooming out and thinking much more about how all of these different decisions come together to create a very seamless environment for people, to be able to create an environment where we can embed a certain amount of care and generosity into the spaces that we're building. I think that becomes really a critical space to be able to jump between, because just to be able to look at it at the kind of high level and city level is, let's say, a certain kind of vocabulary, a certain kind of language and skill, but then to also understand how the smallest details accumulate into creating that space. I think that's also really, it's quite an important thing to realize, because sometimes it does come down to those details.
I know you're now coming into you're thinking a lot more about the public space. And I'm assuming that on the one hand, that must be really liberating and exciting, but equally that is fraught with its own, it's a whole other way of working and a whole other audience. And I don't know what you call it. What do you call a person that comes to like a public sculpture, a visitor or a viewer or an audience?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, okay, so it's also interesting to think about who the stakeholders of a project are. So for instance, the first conference that I organized, the last talk was on care and courage in creating project in longevity. So the amount of care and
So
courage that
before we go ahead, will you say what the conference was and like what you've been doing with conferences and that whole world?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, let's say, a project that's still evolving. But for the past 3 years, I've organized a conference every spring. It coincides with the London Festival of Architecture. And originally, it began as just bringing together people whose work I really was inspired by, who I wanted to, if I was going to meet with them and talk to them about their work, I wanted to also make that something that could be shared and really give it a lot of presence in that moment. And so I came up with 5 themes for the first one, which were abstraction, innovation, evolution, revolution, and longevity. they were values that I thought were maybe not so physical and visited as a kind of they weren't so they weren't so physical, but they were values that I think are very important in considering the way that we approach the built environment. So the last talk was about care and courage and longevity, and we had Lily Jenks, who is very much involved with the Nagy Centers, and Kate Goodwin, who's the curator of architecture at the Royal Academy, and they spoke about the amount of care and courage that should be brought into a project. And Lily was speaking about how, you know, when you design a hospital and you think about who you're designing it for, a lot of times the briefs are geared towards the doctors, but you also have the nurses and the patients. And what about the people who are walking past across the street? And so really trying to expand our consideration for who is going to be impacted by this project. I also didn't necessarily look, let's say, to create a space that was only for conversations led by women, but there was a point where I also realized that being a young female architect, there were lots of figures before me whose work I wasn't as familiar with, that I should have been familiar with. And so that was a kind of also a challenge for myself. I think moving forward, we're not actually necessarily trying to keep it that way, but it is about just giving the time and the space for hearing more voices and bringing these different individuals to the table. And the reason why now we're calling it, we didn't have a name for a long time, but at the moment we're calling it In Conversation, because it's about what we draw out from each other and the kind of challenge that sometimes we can also create, and this process of discovery that we learn more about ourselves sometimes when we're in conversation with somebody else. So whenever we had those in conversation talks, those were always in some ways the most unknown. Like, we had no idea what the outcome would be, but those were always the ones that were the most poignant, because you could tell that even those individuals and those professionals or those artists who were in those conversations, they were taken into a place that they hadn't been before, and seeing what would happen and how we could, let's say, be critical but supportive at the same time. And there was this kind of unknown, open-ended process to the day. And now we have to try and figure out how we can make this a little bit, reach a wider audience, and not so much centered on a physical space in London, but still be able to create this space that has a kind of personal, atmospheric kind of touch of bringing people together in a very curated way. So there's a lot of open-ended questions. How do we recreate these kind of physical connections in a virtual space? And something that I'm just continually fascinated by is also this idea that if culture is something that, let's say, originally starts in communication, and it's about this kind of resonance, whether it's a song or writing or a sculpture or painting, there's also a very spatial kind of dimension to it. And those are the ones that are maybe sometimes not spoken about as much. So many different groups of people can have different reactions to spaces, or even leaning in towards somebody in conversation can be perceived as either more intimate or kind of threatening. And so there are these kind of physical dimensional aspects that cultures also imply, which are helpful, I think, to understand the variety that exists in that world.
I feel we're being forced to confront time more than ever in our own lives. And so I'm curious about how you're thinking about that for this series of conferences.
Well, I think one of the first questions that we want to put out in our conversation is going to be about, let's say, our approach towards time. There are lots of cultures which look at time in a not so linear way. And one of the authors that Arna Piazze had introduced to me, Peter Hoag, has written about how time is often also perceived as a landscape. So whereas there are certain moments that might happen in a linear fashion, there's also there are certain parts that stand out, and it's very much dependent on these inflections of mood and atmosphere and tone. And sometimes there are those marks or those kind of overlooks which really stand out and influence us. So I think also thinking about time with a much longer span, and this idea that if the present is not just today or this year, but the present includes everybody from 100 years before and 100 years ahead of us, that also really fundamentally changes the responsibility that we feel in any of the actions that we do.
That's really moving, right? And this, as we're being forced to pause, and I am really curious about that idea of taking responsibility, and how in your profession, and maybe it's not just about architecture, it's just a general cultural space, we need to start thinking about that, is who should start taking responsibility. And because you can shape experience in the way that you do, you probably have influence on what people, how they're choosing to move and interact. And I wonder if that's something you've been thinking about with your work, or at least with these conversations and conferences.
Yeah, I think it's this is probably the most kind of zoomed out version in which we can really then take that step back from the day to day, and be much more kind of considerate about how we approach future projects, and who do we mean when who are we designing for? I think that that's something. I lost my train of thought right now, but I mean, I think that's something that obviously everybody thinks about designing for, to be as inclusive as possible, but to maybe even stretch what that means in terms of generations or cultures. And now we have the tools and we have the technologies to be able to utilize them. It's not so dependent on, you know, one person sitting there with a pen and a paper, but we can embed a lot of this input. We can embed a lot of the current situations in the environment, in terms of materials, in terms of the way that the flows of people through a city. We can test a lot of this, and we also need to make sure that we keep a certain amount of flexibility embedded within the built environment, because buildings, we can see they change. So now there's maybe less need for offices, and malls are being converted for other uses, and needs of families in housing are changing. So not to treat a building as something that will always be used in exactly the same way, to also appreciate the kind of heritage in different areas and how that can be repurposed. And I think what's really fascinating about everyone that I've met through these conferences, because while we meet lots of different people through the practice, in this, it also gives us a chance to jump out a little bit even further and try and find those other practitioners who can help us to understand a slightly different perspective. So, I mean, recently we can see how public health is integrally linked to everything that we're designing.
So can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, just in terms of the kind of amount of contact, or in a way, the whole situation in the past few months with the pandemic, it makes a lot of what previously was less visible to people, but was always considered, and you know, now it's become much more visible, and so that's always going to be something that is very much valued in moving forward. But I think that there are lots of other considerations as well, which we can bring to more light, we can make more visible.
Well, I also wonder how much that the idea of awareness is, the more visible you make things, the more people are aware. And I mean, there's obviously, you've touched on sustainability, materials, etc., and public health. But at the end of the day, with climate change, with the populations of cities growing, but equally with displacement, there's obviously going to have to be a different way of connecting with, you know, you keep talking about stakeholders, which I think is so interesting, is, you know, how people experience the building and how climate change needs to be addressed through the form of design or architecture. And is that something that you've been looking at or thinking about, or just kind of your observations on architecture in general in the last well, even in the very recent past? Are you seeing any changes there?
In terms of the carbon footprint and keeping a low carbon footprint on any building that's constructed, the most influential decision is in the very early stages in designing the shape, the orientation, and how it's going to stand in relation to the solar gain, and the wind that's coming through is going to impact how much structure is needed. And so to try and minimize the amount of materials that's needed, all of those studies are really critical to do in the early stages. I think density is something that is going to be it's going to increase, because that's where a certain amount of the commerce happens. And as the population across the world continues to increase, it's something that, you know, in cities we can also address it, because people can then walk to work and be much more reliant on public transport and active travel as opposed to driving. And so it's a really, really big kind of framework for this to quantify the kind of analysis on this. I think tall buildings are unavoidable in the future. And I mean, there was one thing, it's a little bit of a kind of sideline, but whether it's in a kind of approach in art or whether it's an approach in the city, there's a lot of kind of, you know, talk about expression, artistic expression, being authentic. But I think from my point of view, it's actually much more critical to approach a project trying to make something very carefully considered. And because that is then actually thinking about all of the people and all of the resources that are going to be affected by a project, as opposed to something that's very individualistic and putting a kind of singular point of view or expression into the world.
And so that's kind of a shift from this idea of what we know of Starchitects, for example, this idea of having sort of a blueprint or being known for something. You mentioned Norman Foster earlier, and I think that's I think it's, well, you are the future of design in every way, and people like you are leading new conversations, and I think it's really beautiful for you to bring that. And so can you say a little bit more about that, and also bring it back to maybe what you were saying earlier about deep time and kind of how you're positioning your own thinking now going into the future?
I would almost kind of want to just leave it at that, because sometimes it can be so overwhelming, I think, to think about long arcs of time and, you know, what are we encompassing when we try and take a project forward? How, you know, it could become endless in terms of the considerations that we have to embed within a design solution. But I think there is a value to at least opening up that discussion so that we can start to find a more kind of shared language, because when different people when words or in different industries, they can mean very different things. And that's also, I guess, what I encounter when I speak with my students, is everyone comes from a very different background. And so when I speak about something, it means one thing. And then when we speak about it again, then there's an additional kind of shared understanding from having visited a space and then having shared that experience. And this happens in a kind of cyclical manner. And I think that across the world, as we do that more, then we can also build up this shared understanding and shared language for design.
So for me, you are actually a curator in almost every way, because you're using the tools, and you're also placing things both in the context of time and obviously physically and obviously spatially, which, you know, is defined in the ways that you want to define it. And so how do you see that translating into the cultural sphere? Because I know you've done quite a lot with museums, and you've obviously worked on art a little bit. So I'm curious about if you have a vision for that. I mean, of course, there's the gallery there, and now you have the conferences. So do you see that? Do you see yourself becoming also, I mean, you already are this very important voice in terms of the future of design, but do you see that becoming more of your time and more of what you're doing?
I think I see it with, let's say, with the amount that my experience as a designer is evolving, and then with the increased kind of opportunities and visibility, where I'm able to also expand and connect on these experiences, and realizing that there's important role to play in terms of translating some of these experiences of what the role of the designer is doing, because actually the role of the designer is also evolving. And I'm constantly thinking about, when I am working on a project, for instance, there was this choreographer that we were working with, where we're really trying to mix ourselves, not just designing the set, and him not just designing, being the choreographer, but we were very much in each other's process. And it is kind of scary because you don't know what you have to bring to the table in the beginning. But then the whole time I was trying to think, how do I convey this to our team? How do we convey this kind of approach, and this approach towards collaboration? Because it's that, I think, is a true collaboration when there's this shared understanding that has to be gained through this interaction of different parties. But I think I'm also very much a practitioner at the end of the day. So it's important to set these things up. We have to learn through doing. At the end of the day, we can read and we can see and we can speak, but we have to, there's a different kind of knowledge that's come, like a tacit understanding that comes through the process of engaging in that process. So whether that's a creative workshop for people who aren't in design, or whether that's also taking designers into a total, into the discussions on public health, those kind of implied tacit learnings, I think, will become much more prolific, because we have the capability to do that now, and they'll become that much more critical for us.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I'm saying this as somebody who works in technology, is that there's this amazing satisfaction and pleasure and growth in hearing and listening. But when you strip away the practice of making and doing, I feel there's an emptiness. And I think you bring a very different self also, if you're not actually spending that time dealing with whatever it means to build something. Okay, so Melodie, thank you for this open-ended conversation. For our manifesto, we have the future of your conference on women in architecture in conversation. And we're going to be following up and bringing this, hopefully, to a follow-up conversation in the next coming weeks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.